So good evening, guys. Thank you for coming. So if you've not heard of us before, we're the King's College Increasing Access Committee for aspiring clinical psychologists, and today's workshop is about interview prep. So be aware most people would have heard by now or are looking to hear back soon. So thinking about some of the preparations that you can do for those, and we have a few panelists today to sort of speak to their experiences. So if we just talk through the agenda for today. So we have the introduction, which will be about 10 minutes, sort of what to expect from the event. And then we have presentations from each of our panelists. Then we aim to finish around 7:10, which will leave us about 50 minutes for a Q&A. Feel free to take a break when you need and have some water and come back. It will be recorded. So if you think that's necessary, then please do. We also encourage you to write your questions in the Q&A function and upvote the ones that you want answered, which will help streamline the Q&A section of today's webinar.
Great, so I'll be introducing today's panelists. Just to get to know before we get into each panelist's presentation, this is all based on trainees' experience and their own personal experience, and it's not anything to do with like advice or kind of prescribing. I guess just to note that when everyone's kind of talking about their own experience. So I'll first introduce myself and my IAC panelists. So I'm Nathan, I'm a first-year trainee clinical psychologist at King's College London. Molly?
Hi everyone, I'm Molly. I'm a second-year trainee also at King's.
And Shanika?
Hi everyone, I'm Shanika. I'm also a first-year trainee at King's for IAC.
And Edward?
Hi, hello, I'm Edward. I'm a first-year trainee at Oxford.
And Faye?
Hi, I'm Faye. I'm a first-year trainee at Royal Holloway.
And Olivia?
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm a first-year trainee at Newcastle University.
I'm not sure if Ruby has joined us yet. So Ruby is one of our second-year trainees at King's College London. She's joining us a bit later and she'll be also presenting. And last but not least, Mark?
Hi all, I'm Mark Borlam. I'm the program manager for the DClinPsy at KCL. So I basically help oversee the selection process alongside all areas of the course. But thank you all for coming, and thank you for all the trainees here for providing this event. Thank you very much.
Great. And thanks to all our panelists for taking the time to share their experience. So I think we're now going to jump into our first presentation. So the first one is Edward. So over to you.
Thank you. I guess, for me, there's three things I want to cover today, but just to give some context, I did interview at UCL, Oxford and Teesside. So basically, that's my experience. I think one of the most important things for me to kind of share today would be the mood that you have when you go into your interview. And I know a lot of you will have probably watched a lot of like YouTube videos that I discussed with other people and like got practical tips around how to prepare for things. But I think very, very important is how you feel when you go into that interview. And I know it is a very nervous event, and I think some nerves are welcomed because that's going to keep you on your toes. But I think it's also something that you should be comfortable to be yourself and allow the panel to see who you are. So whatever it takes for you to calm those nerves to a manageable level, I think you should go for it. And I'm going to tell you what I did. I opened all the cards and the notes that I was given from previous colleagues and service users, patients and clients that I worked with. And that really, really put me in a good mood because there were some very lovely thoughts that were shared there. And that gave me the kind of like warm feeling before my interview. So, like if you have a number one fan, supporting family, mom, dad, whatever you have that, it's going to, prep you up, I would advise you to like have a chat with them just before the interview because you're going to need it. The second piece of advice that I can give is to think global when you do your preparation, rather than to try and focus on very specific things. I think you already know your stuff because you've been invited for an interview. So you've showed that in your application. So I think you are past the point where you can acquire more knowledge. I think at this point you just need to find a way to structure your answers in a way that will reflect that knowledge. So, think globally when you answer a question, and even, start by giving a global answer and then kind of try to narrow it down. I think that's a really good way of, like managing again some of the nerves and anxiety about preparation, like, whoa, what should I focus on? So I think, you have to be kind to yourself, but also kind of acknowledge your strengths and, everything you've acquired until this point. And the final bit of advice, I think, is try to answer your questions in a way that shows your personality. And I think everything that I mentioned to this point should help you to, achieve that. Because I think, if the panelists see you for who you are, then that's going to, like give them the chance and the opportunity to say, okay, this person is going to be fine, on training. This person is going to be fine if we give them, put them in a room with a client, 3 weeks after they join. So, you need to show them who you are, not just your knowledge. And I think those are like the sort of like soft skills, but also like interpersonal skills that can only be, only being shown if you are comfortable in the room and comfortable with the interviewers. So I think one of the questions that I was asked in one of my interviews was along the lines like, oh, what excites you about either being a clinical psychologist or training as a clinical psychologist? And I think like I just smiled and I answered everything. And then I just started talking about everything that like interests me. And when I got the offer, it was Oxford, they said that was picked up on the feedback, and they said they really liked that answer because it showed my enthusiasm. Of course, this is just one example, but I think, it stands for a lot of the questions that you are asked, where you can, show your workings and show you. And so, yeah, I think that's my time up. So I look forward to hear your questions.
Thanks so much, Edward. It was really nice to hear about bringing in cards and bringing in previous notes. I guess getting in the kind of headspace for it was really nice. And yeah, being kind to yourself going in. I think the global kind of answers as well is something I definitely did and I really benefited from as well. And yeah, it's a really important last point about bringing yourself to the interview. You really want to stand out and kind of show your own strengths. So yeah, really good advice there. So thanks so much, Edward. So as Shanika said in the Q&A, we would just encourage people to keep putting in questions, whether it's for Edward or for any of the panelists or just general questions you have about the interview. So we're going to move on to presenter number 2. So I believe that's Faye.
Hi. My connection's a little bit dodgy, so apologies if I'm breaking up a little bit. Hopefully it's okay. I think similar to Edward, really what I was hoping to convey in my presentation was the importance of like letting your own self and your own values shine through in the interview. I remember when I started to prepare for interviews, I remember feeling quite sort of paralyzed by thinking about how much I wanted to convey, and I didn't really know like where to start with prep. I felt like I had loads of ideas kind of floating around in my head, and I didn't really know what to grab onto first. So I kind of think this idea of zooming out and thinking more globally before zooming in was really helpful for me. So I just kind of asked myself why, like why clinical psychology specifically, why this course that I was interviewing for, and then why me, what makes me a good candidate. So to answer those questions, I was thinking about like the core competencies of a clinical psychologist, the core values, but also my own personal like experience, my own identity and my values, like where they come from, how they've informed my journey, and like how that will help me through training. And I found it really helpful just to take that step back because I could then see the thread that runs through from sort of who I am as a person and how that actually translates into the work I do. And I think, yeah, even if it's not explicitly asked any questions about this, I think just doing this like self-reflection exercise is really helpful, and it will shine through in the interview that you really know yourself well and why you want to do training, really, which is what the interviewers want to see. And then after I'd sort of spent that time doing that more abstract thinking, I really then broke down my prep into clinical research and professional issues. And this is more kind of the knowledge-based stuff. So for my clinical prep, I really thought about sort of case examples of work that I'd done that demonstrated good theory practice links. And I kind of had like one really good example of like one example that I knew really well of work that I'd done and a sort of a backup as well. And I tried to think about work that I'd done where I really was made to think and really feel in the experience because I thought that would demonstrate how I work well, and again show who I am as a clinician and you know, provide some sort of rich reflections. And then for my research prep, I really just recapped on the basics. I didn't do anything, I didn't learn anything new. I just went through my sort of undergrad notes, a bit of masters as well, but I really didn't need to. I did things like just critiquing studies from abstracts, practicing like designing studies quickly. And I also had like 2 papers up my sleeve that I knew what they did, I could critique it and I could relate it to the work that I was doing. And I also spent some time reflecting on kind of the role of research in clinical psychology and what it means for me and my values as well, how that all connects. And then for professional issues, I really spent a lot of time reflecting on kind of wider issues in clinical psychology. So leadership, supervision, what it means to work in the NHS, service user involvement, things like that. And I thought about how my experiences connect with that and how I would want to be in all of those areas as a trainee and as a qualified clinical psychologist. And then in all of this reflecting, I kind of used 2 reflection models. I found these really helpful. The Driscoll model of what, so what, now what, and then the Carr model of context, action, results, and reflection. I'm sure people are familiar with these, but I found them really helpful. They're just nice and concise. I feel like they break things down enough, but not too much. Like you can hold it in mind in an interview quite easily. I think overall, things that I found really helpful, top tips, would be mock interviews. I did 1 mock interview with my supervisor, and then I did a lot of recording myself giving answers, which was quite painful to start with, watching those back. But I found that really, really helpful because I can be a bit of a waffler. So it made sure that I answered the questions. It helped me with timings, and it also just helped kind of getting used to putting these quite abstract thoughts into clear sentences. I found that helpful. Another sort of top tip would be just like recapping the basics knowledge-wise. Similar to what Edward said, it's sort of reminding yourself that you have the knowledge. Like to get to an interview is a really amazing achievement in itself. Like you have the knowledge and just not trying to learn any new theories, any new research designs, sort of giving yourself more headspace to think more globally about why you'll be good for training. And then things that I think like common pitfalls that I think would be sort of good to avoid was focus on being perfect. Like I found it quite easy to get kind of fixated on the idea of like an ideal trainee, giving the ideal answer, but trying to detach from that really, because I had to really remind myself continually throughout the process that they're looking for someone to train. They're not looking for a finished psychologist. And just reminding myself of that was kind of helpful. And then also just a little note on like over rehearsing. Although mock interviews are really helpful, you don't want to kind of fall into a trap of rehearsing answers and sort of points to the stage where you almost like become a bit robotic. Like I feel like if you do that too much in the interview, you'll tie yourself in knots and yeah, you won't be able to demonstrate your unique self. And then just a little bit of note about what I did on the days of my interviews. I found mindfulness exercises really helpful. I really like them. I did a lot of guided ones for interviews and like performance situations on the Calm app. And I found that really helpful just to ground myself kind of in the moment so I could show who I really wanted to show when I stepped into that room or logged onto that call. And then power posing. This was a tip I actually picked up from this similar workshop last year. If you search Amy Cuddy on YouTube, I found that super, super helpful for just getting myself in the right mindset before going in. And then during the interview, I think don't be afraid to name the nerves, ask for things to be repeated, write things down. Again, it's really just about doing everything you can to make sure that you're in the moment and you answer things as your truest self, how you want to. And just a note about looking after yourself. I think during and after the whole process, like with social media, just being a bit mindful of that. And also making sure you plan something nice for after the interview, because you will have worked really hard up until that point and you'll want to decompress. And then just some resources I found really helpful in preparing for the interview with the 2 books, Surviving Clinical Psychology and Formulation in Psychology and Psychotherapy. I know they're very widely recommended, but it's for a reason. They were really, really good. I found them so helpful. And then also I watched a lot of trainee videos on YouTube about preparing for interviews, what it's like to be a trainee. I watched a lot of that and I found that really helpful, and it's free as well. Yeah, that's my top tips.
Great, thank you so much, Vero. There's loads in that. I was definitely resonating with a lot of that in my experience. I definitely use the CAR method as well. And I remember, I think we ran this event last year using the power posing as well. But yeah, there's some really good points. I haven't heard of the Driscoll method before. That's a really good one. I like the kind of so what aspect of it, like really not like making sure you're just not rambling on about context, but really about like what's important about it. So yeah, some really, really good points in there. Great, thank you so much. We're going to move on to our presenter number 3, which I think is Olivia. I'm not sure if we have your slide there, or else you can share your own screen. Oh, there it is.
No, there. Oh,
Great.
okay, amazing. Thank you, Molly. Yeah, so hi everyone again. I'm Olivia and I'm currently a trainee at the Newcastle University. So I thought I'm gonna break down a little bit what I found useful when I was preparing for my interview season, and then I feel like there's going to be a layover between all of these presentations because I know a lot of things that were previously mentioned I will also touch on. But I think thinking about things like self-care and looking after ourselves during this period is very important. But Molly, if I could ask for the next slide, please. Oh, okay. So one of the few things I did for preparing for the interview after the initial excitement that I got, I know as part of my trust, I had the opportunity to meet with clinical psychologists within the trust that I haven't worked with before and do a mock interview with them. And I found that really useful because then it was an interview with someone that you don't really know. So it felt a little bit more real. But also you had the comfortableness to think, oh, okay, this is just a practice run and I can learn from this. So if your trust offers something like that, I really recommend doing it. And of course, if that's not something that's available, definitely have a chat with your supervisor or any other clinical psychologists to see whether they'll be able to help you prep a little bit for the interview. Second thing I found very important is self-care. I think we all know it can be very anxiety provoking. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding interviews, and I found taking breaks and not over preparing myself was very important during that time, because I think if you do over prepare or constantly over reflect, that can also have a negative effect. So I made sure that while I was doing my prep, I also had a lot of time for myself and engaged in activities I really enjoyed. And then on the third one, kind of similar to what was mentioned, thinking a little bit more globally and thinking about different themes rather than specific questions. And the reason why I say this is I know some people who are preparing for specific questions during interviews, and then when those questions didn't get asked, it was really like panicky and they weren't able to answer it. So I think focusing on themes was really helpful, because then any questions that kind of came my way, I was able to think of something. So Molly, if I could ask for the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So here are kind of some interview themes. I feel like there is a lot on here, so it doesn't have to be this many. But some of the ones I have focused on was basics such as research. So I had like one paper in mind, which I was able to think about objectively, think of the aims, and then thinking about what went well with the paper and what didn't what wasn't so great about this paper. Kind of reflecting back on your journey as a clinical psychologist as well. So I kind of viewed my journey from when I started working in mental health and just thinking of some of the highlights. How much have I developed as a psychologist since starting to work in this sector, and what were some of the challenges that I faced and how I overcame them and what I have learned from them. Another one is actually kind of thinking about your own values that you bring and how you showcase them within your work. So I know for me, kind of actually having to sit down and think about the values and how they impact my work was quite useful. And then that also allowed me to kind of introduce that in the interview. Have a clinical case in mind as well, have maybe one that went well, maybe one that didn't go so well, and kind of why was this a case that you kind of thought about. And then also thinking about basics as well. So when thinking about research, I used a graph, which will be on the next slide, to kind of inform myself into how does one develop a research, why is it important, thinking about service user involvement, or what are the implications of it. So if Molly, I could ask for the next slide, please. So I kind of used something similar to this in order to answer my research questions. So I know that when I was asked, it was thinking, am I going to be looking at correlations? Am I looking at between groups? And just really breaking it down to kind of know what I'm doing. Again, I feel like this graph looks very scary, but keeping it really to the basics, to thinking about what you would do if you were given a research paper to either critique or to develop your own research. And next slide, please, Molly. Oh, and then lastly, thinking about during the interview, one of the things I found very important is actually taking some time before the interview for yourself, and making sure not to prep last minute. One of my interviews was in person, and during that morning, I literally just went on a walk and just enjoyed the city I was visiting. And then my second one was online, and I just spent some time on like watching TV, watching a show that I really enjoyed, and just really making sure that I can like enter it a little bit more grounded. But during the interview, these are some of the things that I found very useful. Writing down key parts of the question so I can kind of refer back to it, just because I know a lot goes through your mind when answering questions, and kind of having it written down is helpful to kind of think about hitting the key points. Second thing I did is giving myself some time to formulate my answer. I know that if I start talking straight away, I could get a little bit lost, and I found that actually having like 30 seconds to think about and structuring my question was really helpful. And it also can show that it kind of works to sit in silence for a little bit, but this is a personal preference, so it depends whether this works for you or not. I think similar, structuring your questions and answers. So I used the Driscoll's reflective model, and then making sure that when I provided examples, I was very detailed and very specific, but keeping in mind staying within the time frame. And then I also had a look at providing a summary of my answers. So near the end, I kind of gave myself 30 seconds to quickly summarize my answer and then hit in the key points of what I was trying to bring across. And I found that very useful to kind of close up my answer. And then lastly, be your authentic self. I think definitely make sure that your personality comes across. And if you don't know an answer to something, that's also okay to mention, because I had a question that I didn't understand what it meant, and I was very open and I said, I don't know what this means. So it's okay to be honest about those kind of things. And yeah, making sure that after the interview, you're taking care of yourself and doing something that you enjoy to bring down the nerves and kind of enjoy the rest of your day as well. And definitely recommend staying off social media and like the Facebook groups as well, because they can be very anxiety provoking. So making sure you engage in something that you really enjoy. But these have been kind of what I found really helpful during my interview when I was preparing for interviews. So I hope some of these tips and advices were useful. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Olivia. And there's so much in that. Again, similar. I think I resonate with a lot of that stuff. Using themes rather than specific answers, I found really helpful. I remember when I first was doing mock interviews, I think I was coming across quite rigid. So really taking a step back and taking global answers, and then you can, because sometimes you get questions on, for example, leadership and research, or research with something else. So I guess the more kind of fluid and global you are, I think the easier it is to answer. But yeah, there's some really good themes you had, and I think writing down that kind of stuck with me there. I remember in my interview, writing down the questions as they're being asked. Not only does it help you kind of structure your answer, but just gives you time to just kind of prepare what you're going to say, but it also shows a bit of composure as well. Mark, you have your hand up?
Okay. Yes, I was just going to echo you, Nathan, to say it's good to rehearse themes, but we're aware that there's lots of questions on the internet, but those questions will change every year. So if you over-rehearse, we found out for many years that some people can't just, well, if they over-rehearse the question, they can't answer the question that's actually being answered because of that being so. Themes are better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a really good point. I remember when people had told me what kind of questions come up before, I think I tried to answer them, but then I was starting to realize if they were asking a different way, I just wasn't able to answer them properly. So just trying to test yourself on different ways of doing it. I think, as Olivia said, maybe trying to get 1 or 2 mock interviews done with people you don't know and get kind of curveball questions as well. It just really gets you used to kind of being on your toes as well. Thanks so much, Olivia. It's really, really helpful. I see Rubia has joined the call. I'm not sure, Rubia, if you're ready to share now or if you'd like us to give you a few minutes.
No, that's fine. I can share now.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, everyone. First of all, I apologize if I'm a bit flustered. I just got in from work and I just opened my fast with a bottle of water. So I will try to, go through it. And again, I don't know what's already been repeated. But yeah, hopefully this will, what I share, there'll be something that you can gain from it. So my name is Rabia. I'm a second year trainee at King's. And I guess I wanted to start with the Gibbs reflective model. Mainly because this is how I structured my whole application, even in terms of the section where it talked about work, etc. I always use this model, and I've used this throughout like the written application and then in the interview as well. And it's really grounded me because I have diagnosed ADHD, so I find it really difficult when it comes to sort of centering myself when I'm sharing something and making like all the structure be coherent. So this model was really, really helpful, and I think just in general for anyone, if it's first time, second time, etc., centering yourself through this model would be really, really beneficial. So I put an example here, and I've used the one of a translator to walk you through the different steps. So the first part is sort of literally like one sentence or so sharing in the interview what it is you've exactly done, because I think there's a lot more that's prompted on the reflective part as opposed to just detailing what exactly it is you've done, because to get to the interview stage, everyone's got the experience, everyone's got the knowledge, etc., in some capacity to be on the course. I guess that interview stage is seeing, okay, in person or remotely, but talking like, how can you express that? How are you showing that? How is that coming through in the way that you're carrying yourself and what you're sharing? And what are you gaining from the work that you've done? So I would always emphasize sort of using maybe 1 or 2 sentences when you're sharing an answer, just describing what you've done. And then second to that, really going on to the more reflective and reflexive parts. So the first part would be describing the what. The second part would be so what. So what have you learned from that? What have you gained from that? What knowledge, what theories, what evidence base has that shown to you? What have you learned about yourself from that? And then the now what is implementing it into practice. So following this whole sort of example that you've brought up, from the learning that you've then gained, how have you now decided to implement that into practice going forward? So with this specific example, where I say what, for me personally, it was conducting psychological assessments and using translators. And I remember the first time I was using a translator, in my head, how I thought it was going to be to how it actually was in practice was very different. So I started to realize that actually a lot of the nuance of the English translation wasn't being captured necessarily in the translation for many different reasons. And once I started to pick up on that, the so what was me starting to understand and learn that actually that experience of seeing how language barriers can impact psychological assessments was huge. And it highlighted a need, for example, like for training for translators or to bridge that gap, and the fact that that is a big gap. And going forward, what can I do now to bridge that? So that's where the now what came in. And from that, it was, for me, in this specific example, meeting with a translator 10 minutes beforehand to debrief about the session, and then afterwards also. And then again, with the service user, for example, in my specific case, checking their preferences. And if they were happy with that specific translator, then continuing on with them. And the reason why I think structuring it in this way is really helpful is when you're sitting in the interview, it can be really overwhelming. And there's been times, I remember my first ever one, where I would just be like, oh my gosh, what's going on? What's happening? I would like lose my train of thought. But using this structure would ground me and center me again. So I would always emphasize to practice your examples and practice any sort of response that you're going to give with the what, so what, now what model. Yeah, so that's just an example there. And then we go on to the next one. And again, I don't know if this has already been shown, but I wanted to show the wheel of power and privilege. For those who are familiar with the social graces, in some way they sort of mirror each other. But the reason why I wanted to bring this up is in the interview, I think what's really important, I know it's been mentioned already, but is to really bring yourself into it. So part of that is bringing your personality into it and sort of showcasing different parts of yourself. I remember the first ever interview I had, I was literally so rigid. Like I felt like a robot even. I felt like there had to be specific ways of answering the question. And I really got into my head. And yet the two I did after and following that, and the ones I was successful in, for me personally, one of the biggest learnings experiences that I had was that I was bringing more of myself. So even sort of humor, taking a moment to be like, I'm really sorry, can I just have a moment to reflect, to share? Another time I tried to make a joke, but I was just trying to say essentially like bringing more of yourself into that interview room is really important. And second to that, the wheel of power and privilege can be a really useful tool to sort of encourage that reflection and that reflexivity that they're looking for in the interview. So here, if you go around, you have different parts of a person's identity. And as you go further in, you sort of see how they can be attributed to power. So the further you go out, the more marginalized the community is. And it's sort of to start to get people thinking when you're looking at this, okay, when I'm working with a service user, there are so many different parts of someone's identity that you may see and that you may not see. What stands out for you? Why does it stand out for you? What doesn't stand out for you? Why does that not stand out for you? And sort of starting to reflect on that now, so that in the interview stage, you can also bring those reflections forward and start to think about how those blind spots or those parts that do stick with you are going to help inform and yeah, just advance your practice. So I think when you're practicing for the interview, I would really recommend utilizing this wheel of power and privilege, because even going forward into training, etc., it'll be a really useful tool. So those are my main two. I don't want to like be repetitive of what everyone else has already given. So I think I'll just hone on those. I would say use the what, so what, now what model, and utilize this wheel of privilege when you're practicing. And yeah, as I've emphasized, I know it's so much easier to say like on the other side, but really just trying to bring yourself to that interview. I do think personally, I guess this is just my personal reflection, there is something as like over prepping. I do think, for example, like what worked for me was doing like an hour or two a week in the build up, or a few hours more if it was more nearer to the interview time. But I think like alleviating that pressure by sort of breaking it out would be a lot more helpful. And you start to realize as well, when you're practicing, if you space it out a bit more, you can start to reflect on the answer you've given sort of in the previous week and think about it again a week later and think about, oh, okay, how can I shape that? And I would also say do mock interviews. Mock interviews helped me so much. I think having someone just ask me those questions, even though I had rehearsed them in my head, when I was then saying it out loud, it was so much better. And I think the nerves sort of originally from hearing them had sort of deflated a little bit by the time I actually got to the interview stage. So definitely do mock interviews. And yeah, those two tools for me was super helpful, and I'd recommend them. But yeah, I hope I kept to the 5 minutes.
Great, thank you so much, Ruby. That's really helpful. And yeah, I really like the model you use as well. I think other trainees have mentioned it and something I definitely used before. So it's really nice to have a model going in, because if you're struggling to kind of know how to structure it, I guess the people interviewing you are also trying to follow your thread as well. So I guess not having to give them too much to work through, like what are you actually trying to say and follow as well. And yeah, I really like this wheel of privilege, bringing in a kind of a global model you can use for nearly every answer. I think is really important and really useful. Great. Thanks so much to all the panelists for sharing. I think we have one more slide before we get into the Q&A, but while we get onto that slide, I guess we would just encourage everyone to use the Q&A function. I see loads of questions coming in, which is great. I guess we would encourage you guys, if you don't have questions or if you already answered or if you already asked one, to use the upvote function. So the ones that are the most upvoted, we'll try and get to from top to bottom. But yeah, keep them coming in, guys. It's really good to see. So just before we get into that section, we just wanted to really briefly touch on some of these points, but a lot of these were already kind of talked about by our trainees, so I won't go into them in too much detail. So the first one, I guess, is just mind mapping your experience. This again kind of talks to kind of being more global and more fluid with the way you prep. So again, not having really kind of chunky or blocked answers, trying to be by mind mapping, you kind of link experiences loosely, so you're able to kind of, I guess, answer different questions using different components rather than having like one example for, I don't know, leadership or one example for something else. Being able to mind map across experiences can be helpful and to not be that rigid. Using reflective models, as was already kind of talked about, and Ruby talked about the Gibbs reflective cycle, having a model in mind is just really helpful to be able to structure, not only in prepping, but also on the day of the interview, just being able to follow that can be quite clear. Again, structuring your answers. So I think both of these were already talked about. So using the CAR method or the STAR method, again, really emphasizing that you want to be really quite snappy with your context, not spending too much time on that, but more talking about the result and the reflection. That's going to be the one that is most important. This next one, I think all the trainees spoke to this, is having unique selling points, so really bringing yourself to the interview. What are you going to stand out with? So everyone will have lots of different experiences. So lots of people will come with clinical experience, research experience, etc. So you want to be able to show the interviews like what makes you stand out and what's your unique selling point. Like what are you passionate about in clinical psychology? And as Edward said in his first slide as well, like being really enthusiastic about it, I think it really does shine through that this person is really interested and is really ready for training. The next one, I'm not sure if we've spoken about too much, but I think it's just thinking about where you're interviewing in terms of the institution. So what are the courses, values, and ethos? So I think for me, that was quite important, thinking about some of the courses have different values. So some of them might really value being a scientist practitioner. Some of them might value more kind of critiquing things or having more reflective lens. Some people have a more of a systemic kind of modalities that they teach. Having a think about those and seeing what the course values, and I guess you want to show to the institution that your kind of values and ethos align with the course, and if possible, kind of putting that in, and not tokenistically, but kind of showing that the experience that you have lines up, and that when you're on the course, you will enjoy that the ethos that the course has. And something I've reflected on while being in training, I think the importance of just enjoying the kind of uni that you're in and the teaching and stuff, and the more you're aligned and happy in the course, I think the better you do as well. The last two, I think, were already kind of spoken to a lot by trainees, is doing mock interviews. I think for me, this was like probably the most important thing I ever did in terms of prepping, is doing mocks and kind of rehearsing answers. It's good to have examples down in terms of like, I know what to say when, but being able to actually get it across and express yourself in a concise way, I think is the best prep you can do. And the last one, just on well-being, I guess we can't overstate this enough. Again, just taking care of yourself. It's really nice to see the trainees kind of spoke a lot about this in terms of prepping, whether that's prepping or on the day. I think, yeah, trying to stay clear of social media if you can, and just do your own prep and kind of be time limited in that. And even on the day as well, trying to be as relaxed as possible. I think I did something similar. I think try to go for a walk, listen to some music, and not over prep, having some really basic notes. I think the more you kind of go in relaxed and are able to take your time, I think really comes across in interviews as well. So those are some extra points we wanted to get through before we get to the Q&A. So I'm going to hand over to Molly now. We want to start kind of going from the Q&A. So keep putting in the questions throughout, and yeah, we'll try and get to as many as possible.
Yeah, thanks everyone who's presented, and thanks to everyone else who's asked a question and who's upvoting. So as Nathan said, we're going to start from the most upvoted and can go down. Just to say, I'm going to stop sharing my screen as well. Just to say as well, right off the bat, and maybe Mark, you can add to this, is that we won't be able to share here any specific questions that are asked during the course. So if you're curious about the exact questions, if that's a question that you're asking, we won't be able to answer. Mark, did you have something else that you wanted to say before we jump into Q&A?
Oh yeah, just a few things, but I'll just follow up on that. For our questions, they're still under development and won't be finalised for at least a month anyway. And anyone that's applied to us, you'll find that next Friday, just to let you know. But I suppose to just answer a couple of the Q&A questions, I suppose. One is about how questions are scored, what interviews, what courses might do. It will be different per university, but really think of the interview for a DClinPsy course is the same as any job. In the end, it's going to be the same as a Band 6 NHS role. The questions are going to be weighted the same as any application process that you have, but they have different individual scoring, but it's still that sort of level of interview. It's not like any undergrad or master's course that you've applied for before. It is a job that you're applying for, so treat it in that way. I know from our course, we have different experience requirements, different research requirements. If you do get through the interview, we think you've got the level of research experience that we say in our entry criteria, but we will be checking that at the interview itself. But and also that we appreciate that there will be a lot of anxiety in the interview process that is accounted for. I'm really bad at interviews myself, but we're also thinking past beyond that is that after you start the course, you'll be on placement within 3 to 4 weeks. There's a lot of teaching and induction that you have, but we do expect you to be in a room with clients and working at a Band 6 level in 3 to 4 weeks afterwards. So we will be looking as to that sort of detail and ability during the interview itself.
Thanks, Mark. That's helpful to start us off. And there are kind of job specs for a trainee psychologist that you can find online. So I did find that helpful to look at if you're not quite 100% sure of what exactly that entails. You can go and look it up to give you an idea of what competencies and what they're kind of looking for in an interview. Okay, so we'll start with the top question, which asks, how does critiquing a paper come up in the interview? How does that look for the universe, for anyone who's had that experience of having to critique a paper in interview? And how did you go about choosing a paper to critique, or what did you look for? Did anyone have an experience of having to critique a paper in interview? Robia?
It wasn't more so to choose one and bring it, but they sort of presented for one of the interviews, presented a paper and said like what, and sort of a summary, and it was sort of sharing like what do you think the strengths of the paper are and what do you think the limitations are, one I had to read. But essentially it was going through there's like I think it's called, I need to get the name properly. Maybe once I find the name, I can send you the tool. But it's a tool and it sort of goes through different strengths, limitations, and what to look for when you're reading a research paper. So I used that sort of framework and utilized that to help me then for any paper that was coming up or any paper that they would then present to me to sort of reflect back on. So as there is a specific name, it's gone out my brain, but I'll send it over. Maybe you can forward that on to attendees. But that framework really, really helped. But yeah, just looking at strengths and limitations, and then also practicing how to sort of like, if you're going to summarize and feed it back, how to concretely, like concise each section, maybe in like in a minute or so, to help you then once you've concised it, you start to understand the paper better because you're able to then feed that back. So I think concise and getting practice in that's really helpful.
Great, thank you. Nathan?
Yeah, similar. I don't think I was asked directly about critiquing a paper, but I think it did come up in terms of when around a research question. In terms of my prep, I think because I heard people were prepping papers, I was like, that gave me a bit of anxiety to be like, how many papers am I supposed to be learning off when I'm supposed to be doing all this prep? So I think I tried to pick ones that covered like numerous different topics so I can kind of use them for different questions. I didn't want to have like 5 to 6 papers like prepped because I think that was just too much work. I think I just focused on, I think it was like 2 or even 3 max. And I really tried, as Ruby said, just summarizing strengths and weaknesses so you can pull them out rather than knowing like details of the paper. Yeah, I think I found that helpful. Not spending too much time on the prep on that one.
Edward, go ahead. Feel free to just jump in.
Thank you. Yeah, I was asked that question, and I think I read a recent paper relevant to the service that I was working in. So I think, like most question around that was around, can you talk about a recent paper that you read which is relevant to your current role? And I knew that most likely that's going to be the case, so that's how I chose to prepare for this. But yeah, I think if you do read the paper, I think if it's relevant to you or one of your interests, then it's going to give you an advantage on how to talk about it. And equally, I would encourage you to choose a paper that's quite recent rather than like a seminal study or something that's quite old.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. I think it makes sense. I think I also just read one or two papers and just to kind of connected it to a clinical case, and then also thought if I needed to critique how I would. So there's some really good ideas there. So hopefully that answers that question. I can go on to the next one. I think Shanika, do you have the next one ready?
Yeah, I can go to the next upvoted question. So the question says, for those who have had both successful and unsuccessful interviews, can you reflect around the difference between the two, and what do you think the determining factor was for being successful? It's a good question.
Happy to go first.
Go for it.
I think there's an element of luck, and I think overanalyzing interviews, it's not always helpful. I think it's helpful to like listen to feedback and try to think of critically to it. But I think there comes a point where you kind of have to draw a line, because in one of my interview I felt incredibly well about all my answers, and I was 100% sure that I got this in the bag, and I felt like I built rapport with the interviews and everything, and then I was not successful. I did not receive feedback from that interview because I already accepted an offer before that. But I guess you have to apply the same sort of like kindness to yourself. Sometimes, individual differences, rapport that you build, personal characteristics can play, unfortunately, a role into anything. I think just because we're psychologists or we are in the psychology field, that doesn't make us immune to bias or other sort of things. So I think if you're going through that experience and you have a negative feedback or a rejection, then I would encourage you to not focus on it too much and just prepare for the next interview, because it only takes one, and yeah, don't let that down. So
Yeah, thank you for that, Edward. Yeah, so sort of thinking about what feels right to you in that process as well, and going off of that, and things can happen. But sort of, yeah, things can come around quite quickly, so you kind of have to pick yourself back up and go to the next interview in this sort of period. Does anyone else from the panel have similar experience of?
Yeah,
Go
I
for it,
wanted
Ruby.
to echo what was already said. Definitely feel like we can internalize that rejection and into ourselves, and we that also is just not helpful for when you're going forward anyway. But I do think there's an element of luck. But I think for me personally, the first interview I didn't get, and then the second and third one where I got offers, for me personally, I felt a huge shift when I started to view the interview more as a conversation. So I think in my first interview, I was genuinely quite robotic, and when I was feeling back, I was really in my head and trying to think about, even when I got asked a question, as soon as the question was finished, thinking about, okay, I need to say this, I need to say this, or I'm waiting too much. I was too much in my head. I was like, oh, I need to respond in this particular way, X, Y, Z. And I think the feedback I got was that it was quite robotic in that way. I think by the second and third one, I had relaxed a lot more, viewed it as a conversation, and just humanized myself in that process. So, for example, if I didn't know the answer straight away, I would say, like, can I have a minute, please? Or if, for example, I was going off track, I would say, I'm so sorry, just to rewind. I would also just like have make general comments and like just be myself a lot more. I think that humanized both myself when I was speaking to the panel, but also for me in that predicament. Because I think the first time when you get too much in your head and when you try to over rehearse and try to then feed that back, it can be quite telling in when you're having the interview. So I think, yeah, just humanizing yourself in that moment, taking those breaks, and taking a minute, I think made a huge difference, and just bringing more of your personality into the room.
Yeah, thank you for that. It sort of speaks to what you talked about earlier, some of the other panelists, about bringing yourself to the interview and really trying to showcase that personality, and I guess that communicates to the interview panel as well. Yeah. Is anyone else on the panel? Yeah, go for it, Molly.
Like kind of panel adjacent. Yeah, really to echo that that kind of post-mortem analysis that I think probably all of us maybe do after these things, and how wrong we can be. Because I remember my first interview, I thought went really badly. I was quite anxious. My hands shook so much that I couldn't even drink water out of the cup they gave me. They could very visibly see it. I said I needed they redirected me in a question. So sometimes you'll find the interviewers, if you're kind of not answering a question right, they might ask you something else, or kind of to let you know that you're going in the wrong direction. So that happened to me a couple of times in that one, and I thought, oh gosh, okay, I've really messed this up. And I said I didn't know something as well. And I ended up getting that interview, and I think one of the things that they said when I got that when I got onto that course, is they said they appreciated that I told them what I didn't know, and that I was then able to kind of apply that to my experience and still guess and try and kind of expand that knowledge in a new area. And when they redirect, I guess this is to say that just means that they're really trying to help, at least in the 2 universities that I have experience entering for. They were just trying to kind of like redirect and make sure that I had the best chance possible to answer the question. So whereas I took that as a real negative, and kind of beat myself up for it, what it really meant is that I then got the opportunity to answer the question. So just to say that your perception of how things go, we're our own worst critics. And so not to take that too harsh after, and trying to take care of yourself and not think too hard, because the interviewers may have a totally different experience of you. But yeah, again, just kind of admitting when you don't know things, and sometimes the interviews can really appreciate how you can then reason through things and show your thinking and show that you're able to learn, because ultimately as a trainee, the whole point is to learn. And if you're able to demonstrate that, then that can be a positive as well.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. I think similarly I had the same sort of experience, but thinking out loud sort of helped me with that, so they can see that reasoning that you talked about. Yeah. Should we head on to the next question, Nathan?
Yeah, I can be the next one. Yeah, I think that goes back to also just adding to that, goes back to what Mark said about they're expecting everyone to be nervous. So I guess they're also kind of seeing how you respond to that nervousness as well. If you're able to be relaxed and be yourself, I think they're going to be looking out for that as well. So yeah, really good points there. So the next question we have is, for those universities with multiple interviews, i.e. an interview with a panel of staff, then a panel of service users, do you approach them any differently? If so, could you talk a bit about the differences between the types of interviews that exist? So I guess while the panel are thinking about that, in terms of my prep, I think King's is a bit more straightforward in terms of it doesn't have like multiple components. But I do think it's kind of similar prep. It's similar domains you're going to get asked about and similar values. And I guess everything that was kind of said today is quite useful for kind of all those different parts of interviews. But yeah, if anyone else on the panel has had specific kind of tasks, whether it's vignettes or service user interviews, maybe they want to speak to those.
Yeah, I don't mind speaking about that, because Holloway does 2 separate interviews. So we had they told us this before, like a clinical and research interview, which I think was an hour or 45 minutes, and that was with course staff and a local psychologist. And then we had they said it was a personal interview, and that was with a service user or carer representation. That was only 15 minutes long. I didn't approach the prep any differently, because it kind of covered all of the themes that would be covered in, I think, like you said, Nathan, in like your one King's interview. Like it's the same themes that you're covering. And yeah, I don't think I approach like prepping them any differently. I don't think my approach in the interview was any different. I think it's kind of good practice to like maintain, the same kind of stance, whether service user representation is kind of in the room or not, and letting yourself shine through in both of those interviews was most important. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure that's that helpful, but I didn't approach them any differently. I don't think there is a way that you could approach them differently. Yeah,
it's a really good point. I think no matter if you're talking to a service user or a psychologist, it probably should be the same values and stuff you want to get across anyway. Olivia?
Yeah, I feel like my point's going to be exactly the same. So one of the interviews I did had a task that we had to send over a video to in regards to a question, and then I had the interview and it was a panel of clinical psychologists, but another interview I did also had experts by experience in it. And I think in both of them I just went for it as I was in any other interview. There was no significant differences between those two interviews. And I think kind of going back off what Faye said, it is approach as you would, really make sure to showcase your personality. So unfortunately, there isn't like a tip or tricks to kind of approach them differently. I'd say approach them as you would normally.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Edward?
Yeah, I think you will know who is going to be in a panel, and I think that kind of like helps you to think about that. I don't think I approached the prep differently. However, when I did have an interview with expert by experience in the panel, I did find myself maybe explaining things a bit more and using more simplified language. Looking back, I don't know if it was the right thing to do, but I do think I was holding them in mind the most compared to everyone else in terms of like making sure that they understand everything I say, which, yeah, looking back, maybe wasn't the best thing to do. Definitely had an interview where I had to do a presentation on a piece of research that I conducted, and I had an interview with an exam component in it. So yeah, the universities will detail the sort of like interview style and like format, but in terms of prep, I don't think it matters that much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. I guess also something that just came to mind is thinking about the language that you're using. If service users are there, like how you speak about service users, and I guess maybe think about how you'd like to be spoken about in terms of working with service users or patients. In that regard, might be important too. Mark, did you want to come in?
Oh, yes, I was just going to say that all of our interview panels have an expert by experience, either sorry about my dog, a service user or either a service user or carer. But key things are, I suppose, monitoring the language and how you would speak to a client in that sort of way. Experts by experience have equal weighting to the panel members, which might be different courses, but also be aware of the jargon that you may use, particularly if you're from a research background, to try and speak in lay terms, particularly so everyone in the panel understands.
Yeah, really good point. I guess thinking about the language you use generally, the language that you use in terms of being respectful and not being overly complicated, using buzzwords is probably going to be effective with psychologists and experts by experience anyway. But yeah, anyone else have anything to add, or do you want to move on to the next question? No, I think we covered that one quite well. Molly, do you want to take the next one?
Yeah, the next one is just a general. Could you briefly talk through the process of the interviews? What happens from beginning to end of the interviews, and if there are sections, yes, what to expect on the day. This will differ by university. Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to start with Mark?
I can speak from the King's perspective. So we have in-person interviews. There is no everyone has to be interviewed in person. We're not going to do anything online for anyone. And also just for future people, if not this year, all the interview dates are published in line a year in advance. So you should be able to have hopefully availability in that way. We offer you a lovely lunch and a talk. You'll be met by the admin team on the day, and hopefully you won't be waiting long in the waiting room, but you will have generally a 30-minute interview. So we plan 30 minutes for everyone, but if you need adjustments, then if you do get an interview, just let us know, and extra time may be available for that as well. But it's a quite short interview itself, and we usually call people the day after the final day of interviews to let them know the outcome. Sometimes it might be slightly delayed, but also for anyone who's unsuccessful, we wish you all luck, is we do give you developmental feedback on how you may improve for future years. And many candidates that I'm aware who weren't successful the first year have used that feedback and got onto our course elsewhere the year afterwards. So we hope you have a pleasurable experience, but we also appreciate that it's a very anxiety-provoking day.
Can you give any details about how long the interview is?
30 minutes usually. So we have probably about 7 questions. And each question, there's been a few questions on this, will have different timing. So if you ask a specific research question and asking you to detail a particular project that you've done, it's probably going to be longer than some other questions that they might have. But there will be time prompts and people will give you ahead of time.
Thanks, Mark. So that's King's. Anyone else from other universities want to share what their interview process was like?
I'm happy to go next. So for Newcastle, I know it is changing this year. So my interview last year was online, but they went back to in-person interviews. But I know from my own experience, I believe it was 45 minutes for questions, 8 questions in total, I believe about 5 minutes. And then I did also get like prompts with time in. And yeah, so now I do know that it's in person, so it might be a bit different, but there was also time and space to kind of meet current trainees before and after your interview. So that was really helpful to kind of have a chat about how people are finding the course. And yeah, so that's how it was for Newcastle.
Thanks, Olivia.
I can speak about Holloway as well. So yeah, similar to Olivia, I had it online, but I know that they're going back to in-person this year, so it might be slightly different. But as I said, you had 2 separate interviews, so a clinical and research interview and a personal interview with an expert by experience. I had my clinical and research one in the morning, and then I think sort of a 2 or 3 hour break, and then the second one. But I know other people had it the other way around, so I'm not sure how it will work this year. But we got sort of sent some material, like an hour or so before the interview that we had to read over. Yeah, but that was sent by email, and they told us that we'd be asked questions on it. That was an hour before the clinical and research interview, so I'm not sure how it will work this year. But also similar, we had like online team spaces where you could meet trainees before and after, like throughout the whole interview week. And I think similar to how Kings do it, people found out the day after the last day of interviews or quite soon after. But yeah.
Thanks, Faye.
I think if I remember correctly, UCL had an online interviews, and there were 2. One of them was a group task where in the panel was this user or someone with lived experience, and then the clinical task was that you were given, I think, half an hour prior to your main interview vignette, and you would kind of have to prepare on that. The T-side interview was face-to-face, and it was just one panel, which included of one expert by experience, and you had to do the presentation, which was like a 10 minutes presentation on a piece of research. And for Oxford, it was an online clinical sort of like task they had to do. And then the interview was face-to-face, and you would go in and they would do a presentation, and you would have the opportunity to like ask questions, and then the interview was after that. And I think different universities have different sort of like buddy systems or people you can contact to ask questions, but these things are subject to change, and I think different, like each university has such a different way, so you will know once you get that lucky email, I suppose.
Thanks, Edward. And it's good to know that these things do change, and you will, once you hear back about the interview, I think most of them send details about what to expect and kind of how it will be structured, so you won't go into it with no idea. Yeah, thanks, everyone. Does anyone else have anything to add, or should we move on? Okay, great. Shanique, I'll pass over to you.
Great. So the next question has 3 parts, 3 different questions. So I think we'll tackle it a part at a time so that we can stay on topic. So the first part is, how can I link theory to practice in a meaningful way?
I mean, I am thinking that this might be a bit vague to answer from my perspective. I think you have to think of the question that you're being asked and kind of really apply it to either the service or the person that, or the example that you will be given, because I think there is no right answer unless, you know, it's context specific, because I think, you know, you can have the right theory but the wrong context or the wrong person and vice versa. So, you know, there's no, I don't think I can say more than that, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So it kind of depends on the context of the question and how you might do that. Nathan?
Yeah, similar to it's a tricky one. I guess you don't want to be spending so much time learning off models or learning off theories, because otherwise, Edward said, like, you could be using the wrong models or using it inappropriately. I think for me, prepping, I think I tried to learn off a few models that might be used in multiple questions, and whether that's learning off, I don't know, model of CBT or like some sort of key mechanism of change in therapy, or even some of the theories in terms of what Ruby had talked about in her presentation about like wheel of privilege and stuff like that. Stuff that's quite generalizable that you can apply, but make sure it's meaningful as well. So I would always root them in examples and don't just kind of throw in kind of buzzwords or kind of talk about it tokenistically, but actually saying what you actually learned from it, and not only saying like, oh, I use CBT and this is what we did and this is the result. Kind of critique it as well, like why was it effective? Why did you use it? What does it actually mean? And going back to the kind of so what models that people use in terms of reflecting answers, like why did you use it? And like so what? Like what does it actually mean? Instead of just saying, oh, I did CBT model and someone, I don't know, improved in a certain like aspect, but really saying like why was that really important? So yeah, it just shows that you kind of get it and you know the importance of it as well. I think that kind of comes through when you structure it like that.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. So sort of speaking to whatever model you choose and demonstrating your knowledge around it. Thank you. Edward?
Yeah, I was just reflecting a bit more on the question. I think, you know, like I think we do often say, you know, you have to link theory to practice, you have to link theory to practice. So I think one way to think about it, it's not necessarily about something that has to do with a specific example, but it can be sort of like more general. So for example, I was working as a support worker with people with learning disabilities. So in my role, I was very mindful of like communication difficulties and how theory about like effective communication impact on my work. So I think if I would have had a question around that, I would have focused on like social theories and how that was impacting my work as a support worker. And I think it's the same with any other sort of role that you may have. You know, you might work as a system psychologist, or you might tackle conflict in your team, or whatever example it comes to your mind. How was your thinking and your judgment influenced by the psychological knowledge that you have? And I think that is the question in terms of like how do you link theory to practice? It kind of makes you, they want to hear from you, how is your knowledge that you have around psychology reflected in your day-to-day work as an employee, as a member of staff, as a volunteer, as whatever roles you had. So I hope that helps you.
Yeah, that's really helpful to add. Thank you, Edward. Rubia?
Yeah, I guess it kind of echoes what's already been said, but one thing I'd also recommend is look retrospectively at what you've done, because sometimes you can not realize theory you've actually implemented into your practice. I remember, for an example is, prior to getting on to training, I had done sort of a longitudinal like Beck formulation, and I hadn't so that specific model, and I had asked extra questions in the assessment, and I didn't realize until I got onto training that actually there was a model, and it was like a culturally adapted version that had incorporated the questions I had asked. So I think looking at retrospectively, maybe some of the clinical work you've done with service users, with people, and thinking about, okay, what theory was I utilizing then or there, if you hadn't thought about that already, because then going forward, when you're answering these questions, you're sort of gauging yourself to be a bit more reflective on the practice and maybe the theories that you've incorporated that you might not originally be thinking about. I know personally I wasn't thinking about all the different theories I was using in that specific assessment, but if I could give myself advice going back, I would say to just look retrospectively and think about the theories I was including that I might have missed or not known about.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good point in the sense that some of these things, when you're in the psychology world, you're kind of doing it already, but maybe not reflecting on the specific theory from undergrad and things, and it's helpful to have that reflection. So the next part of that question is, what's the difference between a psychological model and psychological theory? Can you provide any examples? I guess it kind of speaks to what we just answered, but in a different way, but any thoughts? Go for it, Molly.
Yeah, just seeing if anyone else doesn't, because I got so confused by this actually when I was prepping. From here, I think now, so a lot psychological model, I would say, is more of kind of the how of therapy and kind of the different techniques that you use, and we tend to others may have different ideas, but the techniques that you use that are then based on the psychological theories that people have. So Robbie was mentioning Beck and kind of using a longitudinal model, which is based on Beck's theory around the way that things are connected, so the way that beliefs are connected to cognitions and actions and feelings. So that would be the theory underlying then the model. CBT theory is the idea that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all linked. So you can see then, you can then think about just what are the theories that then underlie the models that we're using, and you can reflect on those. Yeah, but then there's a lot of other theories like the social theory that Edward was talking about that you can pull on. But yeah, very valid question. I got so confused by that as well when I was preparing. Nathan, do you have something else?
Yeah, I think very similar. I was a bit confused as to what was what. I think I would agree. I think the theory is more about the kind of knowledge underpinnings of why things work. So like thinking about cognitive theory, behavioral theory, social learning theory, and stuff like that. Whereas a model would be more like the mechanism in which that actually applies to clinical practice. So whether that's Beck's model of CBT, or I don't know, Fennell's model of like self-esteem, or maybe a vicious flower formulation, or kind of really specific models you can name in terms of how do you actually apply the theory in terms of mechanism of change in practice, if that makes sense. So I guess the theory is more the broad knowledge underpinnings, but the model is like how to put it into practice and actually makes meaningful change. That's the way I kind of understood it anyway.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think I approach it in a similar way. And yeah, I guess when you read the job spec, it does talk a lot about theory and models, and can get quite confusing. Is there anyone else on the panel that has anything to add to that part of the question? Okay. And the final part is, for a client case, thinking about the formulation, how can I prioritize the key components to discuss in the interview without it making it seem incomplete? Rubia?
Yeah, my reflection really short on that. I guess to choose a model, like a formulation model you want to use, whether it's like the 5 Ps or another one, and just stick to that, and then practice just sort of concising it and honing in on the key points of each section of that formulation model that you've chosen.
Yeah, thank you. Faye?
Yeah, similar. I was going to say, I feel like the best way to practice this would be like doing mock answers or questions or interviews, or like recording yourself trying to verbally explain the formulation, because the things that matter will stand out and you'll be able to narrow it down from there. Or practice with, you know, a mock interview with another psychologist and see if what they take away from what you're trying to explain.
Yeah, thank you, Faye. Edward?
I think for me, it's really important to think about how you bring that person to life, and what is the most important thing if I would ask you about this person, I would be your colleague, what would be the most important thing for me to know? I think that should kind of guide what you bring up forward. And, and if that person would have a voice, what would they want us to know? So I think, you have to hold that person you know, it's not about the formulation, it's about the person. So you need to bring that person to life, and you need to be the advocate for them, and, you know, in a way that, you know, will guide your answer. So yeah, and context matter. I think it's important to say when and how you were working with this person, you know, because sometimes because of like trying to protect, you know, like people, you might just use I don't know, an acronym or whatever you are used to, but I think it's important to put it into context.
Yeah, that's a great point. So speaking like to the person that you're working with and thinking about, especially if there's a service user on the panel, what that communicates and how you speak about previous clients. Nathan?
Yeah, this just made me think about one of the clients I use in a client example. And I think when I first prepped for the interview, before I did mock interviews, I was trying to get across how like complex the case was, trying to be like impressive to show that we worked on loads of different things. But I guess I learned from mock interviews that just picking one or two things, because it's really hard to follow a case and the interviewers don't want to hear about every single aspect of the case, but thinking about what's the most meaningful things. So as Edward said, what's meaningful to the client, like what was the real kind of so what of the work, but also what's going to showcase like the breadth of your experience, because you'd only get a chance to talk about maybe 2 or 3 cases or three pieces of clinical work in an interview. It's quite short. So like what's going to showcase numerous different competencies and skills within a short space of time. So for me, when I worked with a client, we did loads of pieces of work, but one thing was we looked kind of at his cultural background, and also we did a cognitive assessment. I think it just kind of brought together numerous different skills and how I could link theory and practice all in one example without bringing in loads of the formulation. And I guess just to say that they're not looking for a full, complete formulation. And when you're presenting a case, just pull out 1 or 2 things and just say, I just want to focus on this piece of work that we did. Because we, like, interviewers will know that you've done like much lengthier pieces of work, but you just want to show that you can bring through one idea from formulation through intervention through to kind of or from interview, from assessment to formulation through to treatment. So yeah, just focusing on 1 or 2 things.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. I think similarly, I think I actively caveated within answering the question that there was more work within this for the sake of time, and for the question I'm going to focus on X, Y, Z. So it's helpful to preface that if you feel a bit conscious of the fact that it might feel incomplete. Olivia?
Yeah, I think kind of breaking it down, because you only have so limited time during an interview that you can't really go into a whole formulation, because it also depends what the question's asking. And I think actually holding the person in mind and thinking about why you did the formulation that you did, kind of what were the presenting difficulties, how does it link to previous things, but keeping it very brief at the same time. And then also just showcasing kind of what have you learned by doing this formulation, what did you do next, so kind of like the so what. So you have this formulation, what intervention did you choose, what did you do to support the person, so kind of really thinking about the person as a whole, but showcasing your skills in formulation in order to help that person, I found to be quite important when I was answering questions about formulations.
Thank you, Olivia. That's really helpful. Edward?
Just a brief note. I think sometimes you can also mention complexity. You can say, you know, like you can just name it. There are many things that I would have liked to focus on and I cover, but I think, you know, in the interest of time, or like I'm just going to choose 2 that I'm going to focus on. So you can tell them that you know more, but you're not going to have the time to do it. So, you know, this is what you choose for. And, you know, you can explain why you chose to focus on this in your answer. And then, you know, you show your thinking style and, you know, your inside workings, which I think it can be an advice, not just to this question, but to other questions as well, because a lot of the questions have very complex you know, scenarios in mind, and there's lots of routes you can go down to. So, you know, like if you find yourself that you don't know exactly which one to go, or you know that there are more, you can name it in the beginning and then choose to go down one.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, sort of showing that active thinking out loud as well, as you mentioned, sort of helps in that process. We can move on to the next question.
Great. Yeah, I'll take the next one. So just looking at time, I guess we could have 1 or 2. We want to finish with some time to get some feedback from you guys as well. So the next one is kind of specific for King's and UCL. So it's how much research experience do you need? How do you showcase that in the interview, i.e. what is important to you today about research you've done? I guess it might be a good opportunity just to kind of debunk the myth that you don't need a PhD to get into King's. I've heard a lot of people say that, and I guess some people on our cohort and different cohorts have PhDs. Some people have lots of research experience, but equally, I know lots of people on our cohort that don't have any publications or actually very minimal research experience. And I can see Mark's comment that you just are expected to get, I think it's undergraduate level research. Anything after that is obviously going to help your chances of like explaining it in the interview. I think I would probably say it's more quality over quantity in terms of if you have one piece of research you've done, really reflecting on that, like what was important about it, what did you learn about it? And I guess for me, if you're thinking about you're applying for a Band 6 role and what that entails, you're expected to complete a DClin thesis across 3 years. So just showing that you have the potential to be able to do that, not that you've done that like loads of times already. It's more about you have the basic research skills and reflections that you can able to take that on. Again, we were told quite explicitly by the course is you get picked for the course based on your potential to do things, not on your experience that you've already done it. So just showcasing that really. Rubia?
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that research as well. I think a lot of people will think about it in a traditional sense in terms of like academia, publications, etc. But it could be across a whole different number of fields. For example, personally, I was working in a charity and we did a survey and sort of like feeding that back into like poster form and disseminating that to stakeholders or the local community. That's a form of research as well. So even if you, for example, yourself, you don't have that traditional sense, like any sort of involvement with others, etc., surveys, etc., working in a charity, an audit, that all counts. So utilising that as well in the interview and sort of showcasing that and that process.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think for me, especially doing a clinical psychology doctorate, applied research is probably as important or as effective as independent research. And yeah, that could look like a quality improvement project or even just an evaluation of the service you're in, anything like that. Shanika?
Yeah, just to add, in thinking about research, from my experience, is really helpful to think about service user involvement. So if you had done any sort of research experience, whether it's academic or sort of non-traditional, thinking about did you involve service user, or if not, the reflection of that, what would you do if you were to do it differently to involve service users, I think was a particular feedback I got about being helpful to consider within your research.
Yeah, just to add, because I think a lot of people when they're going into interview really focus in on the stats and needing to be very specific about what statistical model they used or would use if they're being asked to design a research study. And I do have a PhD, and I wouldn't be able to just throw out ANOVA and COVA. You do have Google available, so even those of us who have done research don't have those stats knowledge necessarily to hand. So I think I focused a lot more on what I would need to take into consideration when thinking about the design of my research project. As Shanika said, thinking about getting service user involvement or thinking about what the outcome would be that I'd be looking at, what other factors I would need to take into consideration when thinking about the impact of something. So thinking about different confounders, how you would want to measure that, how do you want to set it up. So I think that from the way that I answered the questions was a lot more about the design and just demonstrating that I can kind of think broadly about what would be important when designing a research study, and then also thinking about the results, what that would mean and what would be important, and how you might disseminate that or how you did disseminate that if you're talking about something that you did before and the impact of that, why it's important. So yeah, just say don't get too caught up on the stats and don't panic. I don't think that that's the main thing that they're looking for.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone's really looking for research methods or stats stuff. For me as well, I think it was also important to think about why clinical psychologists spend so much time doing research. Like why is it actually meaningful? It actually helps to improve the service that we do. It helps us be more effective clinicians, helps us get actual real life examples of what's going on for people that we're treating. So really bringing that to your interview and showing that you get why we do research as well. Shanika?
I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep it really short, but I just wanted to add that it's also helpful to consider, even if you didn't complete research. So in my experience, there was quite a lot of fixed term posts, but just to reflect that and say, if I had finished the project, this is what I would do, is also helpful. So don't necessarily feel like you had to have had a piece of research that you started from the beginning straight to the end. So you can also show that you know the process.
And reflecting on what you learned from it, and if there's anything different you might do.
Yeah, those are all really good points. Again, I'm just conscious of time. So we're at like 4 minutes too. I see this next question is kind of directed towards Rubia. Not to put you on the spot, maybe we can answer this one quickly, and then we'll try and get some time for feedback.
Yeah.
So it's, if you can see that, Rubia, it's hi Rubia, thank you for your wheel of power. Can you give us an example of how you would use this?
Okay. So for example, when you're in the room, if I'm reflecting on a case, even in practice, like currently, I would sort of start to think about the person who's sitting in front of me, maybe different parts of their identity, parts of myself that I align with, maybe that they've shared that I share. So for example, faith or racial background, and other parts that I don't share, maybe sexuality, gender, etc. And sort of utilizing that will to understand where my position of power is held in that relationship based on that part of my identity that I share or do not share, and then their respective position. And the reason why it's really important is because then sitting in that room, you start to understand the unspoken power even deeper and how that can play into this sort of like a therapeutic relationship. So yeah, it's sort of looking at, I mean, more simply just sort of like parts of your identity and parts of the other person's identity that you share, and parts you don't share. And even on the parts you share, I think there's this assumption that just because you share a part of your identity, you're going to think the same or you're going to have the same experiences, and that's absolutely not the case. So even within that, sort of starting to reflect on your own assumptions and biases that you may hold based on your own sort of lived experience. And just because you share a part of your identity, it doesn't mean that there's going to be shared experience there. But yeah, it's just reflecting on the differences in within that room and how that can impact the therapeutic relationship, and whether you feel this is just going forward, utilizing that will comfortable to sort of bring that up in the dynamic and in the therapy space. But
Yeah, it's a really good example. I think I touched on that similar in my experience of talking about clients in relation to their cultural background and why that was maybe a barrier to our relationship, and actually engaging with the therapy and just naming that and being aware of it. And yeah, being aware of your blind spots or something else that you align to just shows that you're a kind of open, reflective clinician as well. Molly, did you have anything to add there? Or
No, just say thanks, because that's really useful. Also to bring in, I suppose, thinking about how to apply that in interviews as you're thinking, reflecting on your clinical cases, is bringing that in. And as Nathan, as you were saying, how you use that within a therapy space and how you thought about it. I think that's something that would be really valuable.
Yeah. Just aware of time, Molly, were you able to share the screen just for
Yes.
feedback QR code? Yeah, I guess before everyone kind of hops off, we'd really appreciate if you guys can take 2 minutes of your time just to give us some feedback on the event. We're hoping to kind of run this on an annual basis. And while you guys are doing that, we'd just like to give a massive thank you to all the panelists today for sharing their experiences and really taking the time out of their day, our busy schedules to share. It was really nice to hear everyone's feedback. And thanks for everyone for coming for their questions as well and their engagement.